Manager.
Good morning.
We have a full schedule this morning.
We do.
We'll get started.
All right. Commissioner, we have three topics we're going to talk to you about today. First, we're going to let Tabitha Lehman come up and talk about the 2018 election cycle. Second, we will then, this past weekend with the accident with the police officer at 167th and 21st, we're going to have a discussion about that. And then third, we'll do cleanup with a 42-slide presentation on SMAP. But so we'll let that be the last thing we talk about. But first, without further ado, we'll let Tabitha start us out.
I hope he's kidding.
Good morning, Commissioners. I am here because Commissioners Dennis and Unruh asked me to prepare some information on what I feel like we need to do to be fully prepared for this fall election cycle. So this is a report that we have prepared. I'm not going to read line by line through it. I'll kind of highlight some things because it appears you are very busy and I don't want to waste your time. But certainly any questions that you have, please feel free to ask those either here or after you've digested the information in this report. So the purpose of the report is to provide the Sedgwick County Commission Board with information necessary to make informed decisions regarding some adjustments to the election office budget for the fall election cycle. As we know, the ballot by mail flyer that we've done since 2008 is not going to be going out this year. So we have been doing quite a bit of research over the last few months looking at what we believe the impact of that will be on turnout on election day. The largest thing that we need to discuss is the fact that it's pretty unknown, really. I mean, we may have countywide flyers going out. We don't know that for sure. That might happen, but we can't plan based off of unknowns, if that makes sense. We have to be prepared. I'll read one section here. So in response to long lines in the 2012 presidential election, the President created the Bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration. This was back in 2013. The purpose of this commission was to take a hard look at election administration and make recommendations for areas of improvement. After 6 months of public hearings, testimony, and investigation, the commission made several recommendations, but the one that is pertinent to our conversation was that, as a general rule, no voter should have to wait more than 30 minutes in line in order to have the opportunity to vote. As a result of that work and the Commission's recommendations, MIT created a series of free election tools for us to use to help us project lines and look at optimization of those lines. Our office uses those tools to plan how many election workers we need, how many voting machines, and how many check-in stations. We know from past experience and from observations across the country that election administrators must plan for worst-case scenario because there are no do-overs in elections. We collected data from the 2014 and 16 general elections when the flyer was used, and then the 2017 special congressional election when no flyer was used. And we compiled that by polling location so that we could look at actual trends instead of just projections, and we could see what happens when we send the flyer, what happens when we do not send the flyer. What we found from that analysis, just let me give you the basis. We used the projections of having potentially 60% voter turnout. We realize that's probably higher than it will be, but we have to plan, again, worst case scenario. And that based on the projections that we've seen and the past elections, we based about 28% of ballots being cast prior to election day. That would be down from about a little over 50% that we would normally see in a gubernatorial general election. Again, we don't know that's the magic number. We just don't know, but we have to go somewhere. And what we found from looking at past elections, whether it's city, school, or a special congressional or these others, when we don't send that flyer, we see between 25 to 30% of people vote early across the board in any election, whether it's a primary, a state primary, or a city, school, general. So that was our comfortable zone, that data we could actually get our hands on and wrap our minds around. Because of this, we need to hire, with those numbers, if we have 60% turnout and we have 28% of ballots cast prior to Election Day, we will be seeing more people vote on Election Day than we have ever served in Sedgwick County before, even in presidential elections. So that means that we've got to address that. moving forward. So most of our polling locations, we can address the increase by simply increasing the number of voting machines deployed and how many election workers we hire. That's a pretty simple solution. It does take some resources, but it is a simple solution. But using all that information and then utilizing the tools from MIT, we did find some polling locations that we have some concerns on. Some of these are concerns because there's not enough parking to handle the amount of voters, or it might be there's not enough space in this polling place itself. We identified 13 areas of specific concern that would need to be addressed with more than just adding more equipment and more board workers. If you look, I should have page numbered these, I apologize. If you look at the table that's talking about polling places, we have several polling locations that have more minimal lines. Like if you look at Congregation Emmanuel, we aren't expecting an extreme line that's about 31 minutes. However, if we physically fit the number of machines into that room necessary to do that, the flow is so bad that those lines are just going to back up out the door because we can't logistically do it. So we're just recommending we move that polling place someplace bigger if we can find it. So there's a couple like that. You'll see that also at Studio at Illusions. If you look at First Baptist in Mulvane, this is actually projecting an 8-hour-long line. By 10 a.m. you have a 2-hour-long line, and then it just goes downhill from there. That one is also easily solvable. It's simply a space issue. So we just need to move that to a new area that we can have more machines, okay? Some of these we do need to divide out. This is all manageable. We can do it. We just have to have the resources to do it. So our recommendations is to open 13 new polling locations and to move 3 others to larger facilities, increase our number of election workers. We need to increase the number of positions that we have in SAP because I can get really into that if you need to know, but that one's not going to cost us anything to my knowledge. It's just a procedural issue. Our concern is with the number of election workers that we believe we need to add. Right now, with our current staffing, with the current polling places and what we projected with the flyer going out and what we budgeted, we still have 150 open positions for the general election right now, and we've reached out to all of our election worker pool and called and talked to them. So we're concerned about adding basically 400 more on top of that to handle that and how we're going to recruit those workers. So we need to address that concern as well. Once we know what our polling places are going to be, then we need to reassess how we're going to deliver all the equipment with the addition of polling locations. I would mention this is all based off the fact that we've already added 10 polling locations. With those polling locations, we addressed the 10 largest polling locations in the county, and then with this, it was much more precision, where we went down and we drilled down polling place by polling place and looked at the potential turnout and whether or not that room could handle, that parking could handle it. And instead of it just being based off the number of registered voters, it's based on expected turnout for the 2018 election, if that makes sense. The thing that we don't want to do is we don't want to open too many polling locations and then end up when we have city school general elections, because once we add these polling locations, expanding and contracting is very confusing for voters, first of all, and then we'll spend the money sending them notification that it moved for the city election and then spend it again saying it moved back in the general elections, and it just gets very difficult. So we need to find our sweet spot as how many polling places do we need to add to make this work versus making sure we don't add too many. Does that make sense? So this is what we believe we need to do to get through this year. It may need to be adjusted before presidential election year, but by the time we get to that point, we will have this year under our belt and we'll have a much better idea of what our actual early vote numbers will be. Does that make sense? So we tried to go conservative rather than going crazy with it. So the other recommendation is that with the flyer, we have efficiencies that were gained with how we did it and the timing of when we mailed it, so that we could handle the processes in office with minimal staff. If we're relying on someone else doing it, first of all, we don't know how many absentee ballot applications to accept or to expect. So I don't want to hire a bunch of temporary employees and then have them sitting around doing nothing, but I can also not hire, if I don't have people and then we get overrun with applications, then you see the quandary there. So to me, especially for this election, until we know what our what it's going to look like, it makes the most sense to actually outsource the printing and inserting of ballots to an outside vendor. It does cost more to do that than doing it in-house. However, the risk is we pay for what we utilize, and so we won't have a bunch of extra ballots sitting around that we don't use and we have to shred. We won't have a bunch of staff sitting around not doing something if we don't have a significant number of requests. But we will be prepared if we do get a significant number of requests. So that would be our recommendation as to how to handle that. If we were to try and cover it in-house and we did get a significant number of requests, it would mean we have to buy a couple more envelope printers and have more workstations and more staff, and all of that just seems like a big expense for unknown territory, if that makes sense. So you've kind of got all of our information. I would mention that we did have $30,000 budgeted in our budget to cover the printing cost of the flyer. So we have $30,000 off the top that we will be able to utilize towards these expenses because we won't be spending it on printing the flyer. So I know that's a lot of information that I kind of threw at you very quickly, but does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I have some questions. So, first of all, data was collected from the 214 general and 216 general, and then 217 special.
Yes.
In which no fund. And what's the issue with that, or what's?
Oh, I was just explaining what information we were using to compare to try and make our best estimate as to how many people may or may not vote prior to Election Day. So the 2014 general would be the last gubernatorial election, and the flyer was sent out. And in that election, I believe about 50% of people voted prior to Election Day. The majority of those would be utilizing the flyer. Then 16 general election was just the same thing. The flyer went out. In the special congressional election, we did not send the flyer. One of the candidates did, however, sent several flyers, but we still only saw about 28% of people vote prior to Election Day in that election.
Okay, but should we be comparing a special congressional district election to these other two?
I don't know, but what I'm saying is that's all we have to go on. This is where I'm saying we are in. These changes are in. It's a bit of unknown because we've used it for 10 years and now we're not using it. The 10 years of elections we would have compared to, the flyer was used. So the best thing we could go to, and if you go back to 2006, before the flyer was used, it also had 28% voters turnout prior to Election Day, okay? So it's pretty consistent on any election that we do is between 25 to 30%. If we're not sending something out to voters, about 25 to 30% of people are voting prior to Election Day. It is very difficult to quantify the data. That's I'm trying to express that. There's a lot of unknowns, but unfortunately, and I'll just keep saying this, in election administration, if it's unknown, we have to plan for worst case scenario because there is no option to redo an election. And if we have really long lines, that's if you look back at this spreadsheet, you're going to see the projections of people walking off from these polling locations. I mean, we have one polling location where it's projecting if we don't take any action, we could have over 400 people just give up and leave and not vote at all. So
now, what the flyer that you're talking about, not sending, explain what that is.
That's the flyer that began being sent in 2008. It's an absentee ballot application. It also contains the list of all the early voting locations, dates, and times. And then starting in 2016, we also included people's polling location to remind them where to vote on Election Day. So that's the flyer we're talking about. So what we can quantify...
And the parties don't send any information out like that?
No. And I've been assured by both the Republican and the Democratic Party that they do not have the money and they will not be sending it. That does not mean that there won't be candidates who do that. But the biggest deal that is a difference in when they send it and when we send it is we send it to every active voter. They're going to send it only to the people that are going to vote for their candidate, because why would you pay to send something to somebody who's going to vote for your opponent? I mean, it just makes sense, okay? So not everybody's getting the information. The other thing is most of the time, in our experience, when we've seen candidates or campaigns do this, they're sending the absentee ballot application, whereas we're including all the information about early voting.
You say absentee.
Voting by mail.
Early vote, yeah, not absentee.
Well, in Kansas law, absentee is vote by mail.
Vote by mail.
Right,
Okay,
right.
okay.
I apologize. I'm using our lingo. So vote by mail would be what they're encouraging with their flyer, whereas we're encouraging the early voting as a whole. Does that make sense? Because we're including early voting and vote by mail in the information we're sending out in our flyer.
Well, both parties do.
No,
send that out.
I said they would not. I believe members of the commission board said they would. I said that I'd been told they would not.
No, I mean, in the past, we've had conversations, and you've told me that.
I don't believe so. I'm sorry. Because we've done this for 10 years, so the parties and the candidates don't send out the flyer because they don't need to, because we were. Does that make sense? That doesn't mean that somebody's not going to. It just means it's not going to be the entire county getting blanketed. And again, we send it out in early to mid-September, so we have weeks to process and get ballots prepared, versus they'll send it out 2 to 3 weeks before the election. And the law says we receive that absentee ballot application, and we have to have the ballot out the door within 2 business days of when we receive it, once we start mailing ballots. So our scenario of being able to take 4 people and process something for 4 or 5 weeks, we now have to get it processed in significantly less time. And the flyer that somebody else doesn't have the efficiencies of design that we have worked 10 years to do to process it quickly and with our system. When we send it, we are pulling the data out and we're printing it directly from our database. So we're not having to verify address and name unless somebody is crossing it out. When somebody else sends it, we don't know where they got that data from. So we have to verify every single piece of information on that instead of just checking a signature and a driver's license number. So it does change how much time it takes to process.
Data from you,
Actually, most of the time, no.
where they get it from.
They may get it from the state, or they may get it from places. I don't want to use the term because it's so highly politicized, but you've got all these vendors who do this that you buy data from. And our experience has been, when you're getting that data, it's significantly more out of date than our data. And so it may be bad addresses, people have moved, have deceased, whatever it may be. Because when we pull it, we're pulling it from that day, printing it, and getting it out the door as quickly as we can, versus whatever lag time occurs in the private sector. I don't know. I've not run for office, so I don't know how all that works. But anyway, does that answer your question or questions?
Yeah, everybody I've known is in your office. So
It depends upon the office, though. Yeah.
Other questions?
A couple.
Commissioner Howell.
Just a couple of questions. I would like it, I guess with that change, we become more like other counties. And so we ought to be able to look at other counties and find out what their voter turnout would be based on their practices of not sending that card.
Well, Johnson County does not send the absentee ballot application, but they do send actually multiple mailers before elections. They send a mailer before every single election to everybody who's eligible to vote. And that includes the early voting locations, dates and times, and then a link to where they can go on the website and download the application. So Johnson County does do that, and they see about the number of early voter turnout that we do. I would have to look at Wyandotte and Shawnee County and see what their numbers are. I can do that for you and be happy to send that to you in an email.
I'm just saying there's a lot of counties out there that would be very much like what we would be doing here. So we could look at those counties. And
Which counties would you think would be like us?
I don't know. I'm not
Okay.
sure. I'm not
Okay.
the one that can answer that question. But I'm saying there's a lot of counties I would think would be similar to Sedgwick County at this point. So
Well,
we could look at those.
demographics within counties, what works in Johnson County is significantly different from what works here. If they have a 10-minute wait in Johnson County, they're getting in pretty significant issues there. So it's a difference of demographics as well. But I will say that the next closest county to us is Johnson County, and they do send a mailer. It
And we
just
do-
doesn't include the absentee ballot application.
And we do, just for clarity, we do send a voter registration verification card. That's required by statute, I believe.
Yes, but if you registered to vote in 1992, unless we've changed your polling place, your card is from
My point
1992.
is if someone registers or re-registers or whatever, they'll get a card in the mail.
Right.
As well as if you change your poll site
Yes.
assignment.
Absolutely.
That's also notification that goes out. So there are some other mailings that do go out. And then I guess I'd say, I don't understand the math between your on your chart here. How are you doing the math between the max wait time with and without walk-offs? How are you calculating that?
That is this tool that has been developed by MIT by statisticians and people who have studied this and done line management. And so what we do is we put in the number of people we project are going to vote, how long we think it's going to take them to check in, how long we think it's going to take them to vote, how many voting machines we have, and then it tells us if no one leaves, here's your line. but they project that X number of people. So if you look at Bel Air City Building, it says that if no one gives up and leaves, we'll have a 2-hour-long line. But it projects that almost 170 people will give up and walk away. If those 170 people give up and walk away, then our line's only 1 hour. But we lost 170 voters.
Can you send that, is this an Excel spreadsheet?
It is, and if you look, and yes, I'll be happy to email it to you, but if you look at the bottom, I did cite that, so you've got the web address where you can pull that up, that tool.
Well, just if you
But I'll
wouldn't
be
mind
happy to
sending
send
us
that to you.
The tool that you used or the Excel spreadsheet, I'd like to see the math on that. And then I guess I'd like to just go back, you know, when I first became commissioner, I think we had 64 poll sites at that time, and I think we purchased equipment with the intent to go to 100. And so I'm wondering, where are we on that plan to go to 100 poll sites?
Well, this would, first of all, that 100 is a fluid number. We need to, you know, again, as I spoke to, I don't want to just add polling locations for the sake of adding it. We need to be deliberate in where we add them and why. So this would get us to 86 total across the county.
Why are we not going to 100?
Because at this point, I don't believe it's necessary for the number of people that will turn out for the general election. If we may need to get to that number before the presidential, but if we don't need to add that for this election, that's a significant amount of expense. Does that make sense?
Not to me. I think we ought to go to 100.
Okay.
But
Well,
we
I need a
planned
new
on
warehouse
that.
and a new office
Yeah.
because I can't fit that in there.
Okay. And then if someone does walk in, don't they have the option of going to a paper ballot? If they see a long line, they can say, I'll just go ahead and do paper today.
Yes, they do. And that thank you for bringing that up because that is something I wanted to address because in years past what we've done is we have the touch, you know, you had the electronic voting machine and then we provided a lot of paper ballots, and if someone didn't want to wait in line for the electronic machine, they could go vote on the paper ballot. And while that option is still available to them now with our new equipment, because every single voter is casting a paper ballot now, whether they do it by hand or they do it by the machine and it prints it out, our bottleneck is not going to be at the touch screens. It's going to be at the tabulator, because now every single voter has to put their ballot through that tabulator. So we can't use paper balloting, hand marking paper balloting as our stopgap anymore because we will still have to add another tabulator. So if we can't fit another tabulator in the room, we can't use that paper balloting as our stopgap. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess my experience so far is I've never seen a line at the tabulator. It's always been people waiting for a machine and they walk
Right.
over. But that's fine.
But we haven't had 60% turnout yet in an election. And we are, this is the perfect storm of many unknowns. We have not used the new equipment in this large of an election yet. We are talking 33 offices on every single ballot, some of them more. We may have constitutional amendments. We don't know. Not looking likely, but we might, okay? But we also have jurisdictions who have contacted us and are talking about putting questions on the ballot. Everything we do adds to the length of time it takes that voter to vote. And what I have to take into consideration is the moment that person's in line until they walk out that door, how long did it take them? That's what I've got to cover. So if I'm saying I think it'll take someone 5 minutes from the moment they check in to they go to the ballot marking device, fill out their ballot, and then they print it, and then they go to the secondary device, have it counted, and finally walk out the door, I think that's a fair number given how many races. It may be a little high, but again, we have to go high because we can't have 417 people walking out in Mulvane and not voting. We can't do that, okay? I cannot sign off on doing that. So we're just in that point where we've addressed most of the concerns with adding machines. We will probably have to, I would anticipate we will have to address it with more polling locations before the presidential election. But there's a scalability here. We're talking, at this point, I don't, even just adding 13 polling locations, we've been working on trying to find them. We've done a couple of ADA checks. So far, the ADA checks aren't going so hot, and potential polling places are falling off the list. Getting that many polling places added in the amount of time we have is not a doable thing.
Have you asked our manager for help with that?
This is part of what we're doing here, is
okay.
providing this information so you know what our needs are. Again, I will come back to anytime we're adding a polling location that's adding delivery routes, that's adding more machines that have to be prepared and put out the door, and we have to store all of those supplies. We have supply tubs and all those things that we right now are maxed out on space. And we are gaining a little space because the sheriff's office moved things from the law enforcement training center over, so they're gaining, but we don't know how much space that is in our warehouse, but it certainly wouldn't be enough to cover 100 polling locations. So And I think if we went to 100 polling locations for this election, we would end up with board workers sitting around twiddling their thumbs, potentially. It's a potential. I don't know for sure.
There'd be no wait.
Correct,
Okay.
which would
That's my
be
point.
anyway, I just won't even make a further statement.
Just to comment, this is, you're asking for about a 60% increase in poll workers. Mm-hmm. And we already funded significant capital investment to buy this equipment, which would reduce the waiting. And you just said that just now. To me, I think that we ought to implement our original plan. That's to get to 100 poll sites, and we've already invested in that. We ought to get that done. And if other staff is needed to help with that project, then I would like to see that happen. I think that's where we ought to be invested in that. That should have been a guaranteed thing. We'd go to 100 poll sites this election cycle. Not in my opinion. That should have been our goal, and we should have made sure we got there. But that would have
Well,
reduced
again, I will reiterate that 100 polling places was a projection just based off of we have to get used to the new norm of how many people are going to vote early. If we still see 40% of people vote early, there's no reason to have 100 polling locations because we won't need 100 polling locations.
I'm not sure that your numbers are right, but let's assume there's a 20% shift in how people vote. Mm-hmm. That 20% shift is not going to require a 60% increase in poll workers. And I don't know that we've already talked about a more than 50% increase in poll sites. Mm-hmm. So to me, there's a number of ways to help this thing. And I think on this initial election, you ought to have the paper ballots ready to go just in case there are lines, because this is a transitional election, so to speak. But people always have the option of voting paper once they check in, and checking in's fairly quick. It's potentially waiting for a machine if there's a long ballot, as you already said. But those tables and those areas where people can vote by paper really gives them an option. They can get in and get out in less than 30 minutes pretty much every time, no matter what's going on with other equipment there. So I understand about the tabulator. I get that. I don't think that's going to be the big concern.
I would mention that when we add machines, if I put 10 voting machines in a polling place, but I only assign 2 people to run those machines, it doesn't matter if I have 10 machines. 2 people can't get voters set up on 10 machines. So we have to scale the number of election workers. And again, I will go back to pointing out that we're talking about having more people potentially vote on election day for this election than we've ever seen in Sedgwick County. And once we start scaling that up and we have that many people showing up to a polling location, we have to have a chance for board workers to take breaks. And we need to then have someone who is, more watching lines, making sure no one misses having their ballot counted and doesn't leave with a voted ballot. There are just a lot of things that when we're talking about that many people, we have to increase the number of election workers.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Donnell?
Thank you. Thank you for this overview, Tabitha. So maybe a question. You're talking about Johnson County just sending out a generic postcard. Have you figured out what the cost would be if we just sent a small postcard to say, here's early voting starting this week, and you just send a blanket generic postcard out to the entire county? What would that cost?
I have not. I can do that, and I'll be happy to include that in
maybe
links that Commissioner Howell.
That was a good compromise on the initial ballot, like you did, more towards a Johnson County type style.
Okay, we can do that, and if it
know. And then, do you do anything like with online advertising, with the cost being so much cheaper?
We do. And this is where I guess getting in a little bit into ethics and how do you encourage turnout. When, say for instance, I purchase an ad, whether it's in a newspaper or it's on TV or online, I'm reaching a very specific and small segment of the demographic of voters. So my concern is, unless I can blanket everything, like we're pursuing some Facebook advertising to recruit election workers. Okay, that's a little different than here's your voting rights, and I'm only sending it to Facebook. Okay, so the only people who are going to see that are people who are on Facebook. That's not all the voters of Sedgwick County. Sure. So that is why we have settled on doing where we mail something to every voter, to where every voter is getting access to the exact same information. Because if I put an ad on at 8 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to hit those demographic of voters who either can't sleep or have a job to get to, or I put it in the paper, I'm hitting the demographic of voters who subscribe to the paper. So it's, other counties put a billboard up. Well, they have one billboard in their entire county. Great. I don't even know how many we have in Sedgwick County. So that's a good idea, but it's also just, we have it on our website. We put it out on social media. But there's a fear there that I would be selecting which demographic of voters we're encouraging to vote, and that's something to me that I'm not excited about doing.
True, but you would reach a much larger audience for a very small, limited cost.
Yes, I hear that,
and it
but
would be, and I don't necessarily think it'd be discriminatory, because you could just do 18 plus everybody that has that. Same with Twitter.
oh, right. But I mean, how many people don't have Facebook that wouldn't see it?
20%.
Okay, so I've encouraged 80% to vote, but not the other 20%. And what are the
You're only projecting
right?
60% of people voting.
Right. But again, I'm just going to come back to that's why we have not pursued that, is because if I can't encourage everyone, I feel like that then becomes the roles of candidates and campaigns and not my office. Because if I'm encouraging everyone, if the county's putting something on Facebook, that's fine. That's not me. That's not my office. You see what I'm saying? It's just a quandary.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Commissioner Lehman, I appreciate you coming today. I know you want a couple responses from us. First of all, your one recommended action is to open 13 polling locations. You're the expert. Going to 100 right now, if we don't have the analysis, I don't know that we need to do that, but I think that we probably should follow your recommendation and add the 13 additional ones and let you relocate the other ones. One of the things I've got a question on, the SAP. What's it take for us to change SAP so that we can add more people?
Nothing at all, sir. We can add as many positions as we want. We just would require commission approval in order to establish those additional positions. But SAP technically can handle as many as.
Okay. Well, I think that's something we ought to do. One of the concerns, and I think you mentioned it, was you can't find enough people. And if we start adding more positions, you've got to find even more people. Well, one of the problems when you and I discussed this was it's a long day. It starts at what time in the morning?
4:45. And you
it
can't
runs-
leave until it's done.
Can't leave until it's done. But a possible solution to that is to break up the day
Yes,
so that they only
absolutely.
have to work a half a day. So one person can come in. And if we had the positions in SAP, you could do that. But right now
Right.
you can't
I can't.
split up those because
Right.
we don't have enough positions in SAP.
Correct.
So I think it's really a couple-prong approach. Is that
Agree.
if we can add the positions, and you can go out and tell the poll workers, hey, you're only going to have to work a half a day. We're not going to have 16-hour days for you.
Right.
You might have an opportunity that you can go ahead and find the poll workers.
And-
No matter what, we have to have poll workers.
Right.
You can have 100 sites,
Right.
you can have 200. If
Right.
we have no poll workers,
Exactly.
you might not have any sites. So, I think that's important. I think we'll probably have to take a little bit of time to digest your recommendation on increasing the salary. I don't think that's something.
Right, and I didn't put anything in here because that was something that Commissioners Dennis and Unruh, you and I had talked about, but I didn't have any direction as to how much of an increase, and with the amount of election workers we're talking for this year, that would have a significant budget impact, and so I wanted more direction from you before we spent the time to do any research on it, because that's why I put it in here, but I didn't flesh out any cost amounts, because that to me was too many unknowns to actually figure out how to address. I would mention that one of the things that we see, and this is reflected in our costs for election workers and kind of our numbers, is that we see about 40% attrition in the number of election workers we hire. So meaning like for the November 7th general election, we had a 40% drop-off rate of people that we had hired had agreed to. Most of them attended training, and then they canceled and didn't show up, and we had to replace them. So that is reflected in, we have the number that we feel like we need to get to make sure polls are sufficiently staffed, but then you'll see in the dollar amount it's actually higher than if we just paid them the straight up $120, because first off we have to train them, that sort of thing, but then we have to account for that attrition rate of we've already paid these people because they've attended 5 hours of training, and now they've quit, and now we have to find somebody else, and we still have to train them for 5 hours and then get them to the poll. So we have a significant amount of attrition there, and that takes a lot of staff time to manage. That is one of the things that is a concern to me, that I did want to mention, so thank you for asking the leading question, is we have one full-time staff member right now who manages election workers during general elections and even-numbered year. We hire a temporary staff to help her. If we are increasing these numbers of election workers, 2 people aren't going to be able to handle finding these people, hiring them. We've already been being pretty aggressive. I think in the last 2 weeks we've already gone to 4 different locations speaking, trying to recruit election workers. You know, we actually got several from the Mayor's Youth Council. I'm pretty excited about that. They're young. And hopefully will stick with us for a few years. We've already started on that campaign to try and help, and we've been working with communications on how we can best do that, and hence doing some Facebook advertising to recruit election workers, things like that. Because specifically the people who use Facebook are the demographic we are looking for because they're tech savvy. So that is who we want to target for election workers, if that makes sense. So I agree. I think on the potential of a change in salary, that's something that has to be, I need more direction from you before we can even start down that process and talk to budget and things like that.
And we can have a discussion on that and get back with you on that. The aggressive public campaign to recruit new election workers, I think that's probably something we probably ought to take a look at. And then, of course, once you find your new locations, you are going to have to figure out how you get all that delivered.
Right.
To the new locations. So I don't see a problem with that. I think the outsourcing of the printing and folding and so forth, that's something we probably ought to talk with the manager about a little bit and see if there's some other option, or if that's the only option. And I think that we can staff that and take a look at it and get back with you on that possibility. I guess I need to know if the rest of the commissioners agree with some of the things I just said or not, so that you've got a direction to go. Commissioner Unruh?
Well, from your recommendation, Madam Commissioner, you say a net additional $100,000 you need for your budget. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's to cover. Let me get over there. That's to cover increase in board workers, and we did a rough estimate of what polling place change notices are. Until we have those polling places figured out, we don't actually have a hard number. That's just a very rough estimate. Yes, so we can begin. Part of the, we've already started part of this process. For us, with the primary coming up, we actually only have a couple of weeks before we have to know what our polling places are hard and set for the primary. So some of this, we will be adding polling locations as quickly as we can, but if there will be changes between the primary and the general, and I really did not want to do that because I'm very, very concerned about voter confusion of their polling place being different from the primary to the general. However, if it's kind of 6 of one and half dozen of the other, the concern I have on the flip side is if we mail something to them saying your polling place changed before the primary, and they don't intend to vote and they don't particularly pay attention to that, will they remember that by the time we get to the general? And so I can make the argument for leaving polling places the way they are for the primary and expanding for the general. I can make argument both ways, and so that's still something we're kind of, if we know a polling place is being targeted because we're concerned about lines there, we can hang signs during the primary that says if you vote here, it's likely to change before the general. We can do things to help voters know that it's going to change for the general, but that's still something we're still ironing out as to how we're going to handle.
You're telling me that with all these potential changes, you have no idea what the cost might be?
No. I'm sorry. We did our best to quantify the cost here, what I've put here. But I'm saying that on the polling place change notices, that number may fluctuate a little because it depends upon which precincts we move, how much that's going to cost us.
To do a good job that you're responsible for, how much more money are you asking?
Right now, with what I presented here, it's about $100,000, but that depends upon whether or not we outsource the printing of those and inserting of the ballots, because that's a fluid expense that we'll only be paying for what we have requested. So I don't know what that expense is at the moment. So and we did not. I agree. Meeting with the print shop and mailroom and seeing what our options are is a good idea. One of the things that we do know is that we are expecting some legislative changes on the ballot by mail envelope, which you're all very well aware of. And if we don't have the legislative change, we're likely to see a new rule from the Secretary of State's office regarding the language on the ballot by mail envelope. We did comparison between our envelopes and I think about multiple other counties. And while the verbiage of information is the same on the envelopes, we're the only ones that use a number 9 small envelope. So the information that we have on there is very compressed and it's small font, so it's difficult for voters to read. What we've discovered with the other counties is they use a larger envelope, which keeps the postage in that letter range, so your postage doesn't change, but the cost of the actual envelope goes up. But we, as those of you who were there for canvassing of the special election in February, we did a test run of a larger envelope, and we did not have a single person return their envelope without a signature. Now, we only sent out about 400 ballots. Okay, so that's it's not indicative of what we will see this fall. But and in looking at best practices for designing things, the smaller the font, the busier it is, the less likely is people are actually going to read the content that's on there. So one of the things we anticipate, which is not quantified here because we don't know those costs yet, it depends upon if we outsource or do it internally, is increasing that envelope size, because if we get a mandate saying we are changing what's on the face of that envelope, we cannot fit anything else on that envelope that's already maxed out. We're already printing on the flap, we're printing everywhere, okay? So we have to go to something bigger. And that, how much we print on there determines how much that costs. So we have to find out all that information before we can quantify that. But the information that I brought to you so far is approximately $100,000, yes. I'm sorry, that was a very long answer. I apologize.
I agree with you.
Fair enough.
Tabitha, is that approximately 100,000, or is it this close to 130,000?
Well, if you notice at the very top of the cost analysis, I include that we had $30,000 in our budget for printing the flyer, and since that's not happening, we can reallocate those resources to paying $30,000 of this $128,000.
Okay. Depending on outsourcing.
But that does not include the outsourcing. Right. Correct. Right, correct.
So if we go with a full Monty, it's going to be a little bit more than this.
That's what I figured. I know that this indicates 100, but it seemed like it's an undecided plan, right?
Right. I needed more direction from you all before I fleshed out any more on the rest of it.
Well, with what direction you have right now, can you flesh it out
Yep, we can get moving.
more closely? But I'm not sure I've got direction. I need
Okay.
consensus yet. Commissioner Rance.
Yeah, I guess I have more questions. I mean, this is the first I've seen this. Has staff analyzed this?
No, this
No.
is the first we've seen it.
But we're happy to work with them.
Okay, so you're thinking about changing the polling location from the primary and general.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and how is that a normal thing, or how often do you do that?
We've had it happen a couple of times, but it's been like one polling place here or there, not a significant number between the primary and general. It's and you know, as I expressed, it's not optimal, but we don't know for sure that we can get all the polling places to agree and get it done in time for the primary.
Okay, now I just want to clarify. Go back. This discussion about sending out these advance ballots has been going on for years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is this required for you to do this required by law, or this an option?
The ballot by mail flyer is not required by law.
And I thought that about 25% are returned and 75% are not. Is that roughly?
I think that's probably about accurate. But again, we don't know how many people vote early because of the information on the flyer, because they don't have to bring that in and submit it when they. So we really don't know the impact on early voting at this point.
Well, I know we had this discussion back when Commander Buchanan was here. I remember having a discussion with you about this, that if we increase the polling places, this wouldn't be necessary. We have increased the polling places, and we've spent how many millions of dollars in new equipment, like Commissioner House said, to make it more efficient, which is one of the reasons we bought this. I was told we were going to get this equipment, it'll be more efficient, we can do more people and not need as many polling locations. And now I'm trying to, I personally, I don't know if I'm prepared to make a decision. I've got to look at this information here, you know. We all know that this has been an issue. There's been some legislation about commissioners having to say in election, budgets, and there's some conflict there and hurt feelings, and I want to make sure this is a reasonable.
I would mention that
The comparison to the special election, I'm not sure is a valid, but I have lots of questions, I guess. I didn't realize this was going to be here today, and staff hasn't had a chance to evaluate it. That's why I just have questions.
I would mention that when you said we've added polling locations, yes, we did. We added 10 polling locations this year. But since the 63 polling places were set, we've added 60,000 registered voters. That 10 polling places doesn't even necessarily address that 60,000. So our plan was to implement polling places slowly so that we did not have mass changes in one election cycle, because that's where we start. I worked the polls in 2006. In 2006, we had brand new voting equipment, and the polling places went from over 200 down to, I think, around 63. And I got yelled at all day long by angry voters who were so confused. So I was trying to do this very incrementally and to make sure we got the right number of polling locations instead of just blanketing it out of fear that we're going to have really long lines. So and yes, we did buy enough equipment to add more polling places. That was part of the plan, but this was done very quickly instead of the slow, deliberate process that is what I believe should have happened.
It's always been that we're going to have more polling places, new equipment. The parties would, if we don't send out these things, we're not required anything to do. The parties would do it themselves, and this wouldn't be necessary. Now I feel like the message is changing, and I'm confused that I'm getting an inconsistent from what I've been told in the past, and so I've got to read through some of this and see what reality is.
Commissioners, can I make a suggestion? You receive a file, let the staff look at it, and we'll bring it back to you in a commissioner or budget workshop. I think would probably be the best way to do it.
Well, I was going to make that recommendation up to a point, because I need to know when she needs information about the additional polling places.
We have the $30,000 in our budget where we can add polling locations, and we can do that. We can start on that because we have budget authority to do that. It just may be how many board workers we hire, maybe of some discussion and things like that. So we can get started because we do have budget authority to start this process. It's just I did not want to wait any longer to give you as much of the overall picture as I could.
Okay. I think increasing the number of polling sites is something you need to move ahead with.
Okay.
We probably are not going to get a final decision for you today.
I did not anticipate you would.
We will work with the manager to get you back on the agenda in the very near future so that we can come up with information. If any of the commissioners have additional information that they would need, if you could let the manager know so that we'll all know what the questions are, and get those over to Commissioner Lehman so that we know what the questions and we all get the answers back together. That sound reasonable?
That does. Thank you.
All right. Well, I appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
It may not be the right 13 if you're not doing it.
Mr. Manager, what do we have next?
All right, we're
got
gonna
two more.
yes, and we're gonna talk about the first one is the tragic events that happened over the weekend at 167th and 21st.
Thank you.
And Sheriff will start off the discussion.
Good morning, Sheriff.
Good morning.
Appreciate you having me here today. Basically, it's going to be several of us presenting some information in reference to the intersection at 167th and 21st Street. As many of you know, there was a double fatality out there involved an off-duty police officer and his son. Through the different media outlets interviewing individuals in that area, and then speaking with me on different occasions, and some information that wasn't completely accurate in some of those reports, but the citizens have a strong concern about that intersection due to accidents in the area over the past several years, injury accidents and fatalities. So yesterday, Mr. Bortz, Mr. Spears, myself, the manager, and some other folks sat down to take a look at what statistical information we could pull to take a look at exactly what the statistical information is. Mr. Bortz was able to pull information from January of 2014 to April 28th of 2018, which was very similar to the information the Sheriff's Office was able to pull. And that was that there's been a total of 18 accidents at that particular location. 9 of those accidents were injury accidents. We've had 2 fatality accidents and 2 DUIs. The manager was also able to provide EMS CAD information, which was very similar to what we had pulled as well, that there was 9 injury accidents from January of 2014 until here recently, as of Friday night. So with that information, I think it gives us a better look at what we're actually, what the statistical information is telling us. That the amount of accidents. There's a lot of, I grew up in that area, so there is a lot of perceptions out there that there's accidents there all the time. As you can tell, there's been 18 accidents since the beginning of 2014. Some of them are very serious accidents. Some of them are fatalities. We also have those type of accidents in other parts of the county that the traffic engineer has been able to take a look, do a study, take a look at those different intersections to see if there's other things that can be done from a county standpoint. We also do a lot of traffic enforcement in those major intersections because we look at high accident locations. And then we place staff out there to be able to do traffic enforcement, to slow down speeds and those type of things. I will tell you both of the fatality accidents, the one in 2017 and the one here most recently, generally what those accidents consist of is individuals stopping either north or south on 167th, pretty much just kind of glancing both ways and then kind of darting across the intersection without really taking the time to look to make sure no traffic's coming. Both of those fatalities involve motorcycles, and so there's issues with the fact that a lot of it is driver intended. I mean, it's because of inattentive driving, those type of things. Again, 2 of the accidents, the one most recent was DUI related, which has nothing to do with traffic control devices out there. So that's the information that I can present to you from a statistical standpoint, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions, but I know some other folks are going to get up and talk to you about the actual intersection and the traffic devices and those type of things.
Okay, Commissioner Unruh?
The 2 fatalities, does that include the most recent accident?
Yeah, those are classified as just fatalities. It might be multiple victims, but it's a fatality. The first one in 17 was a 1-person fatality. The one Friday night was a 2-person fatality.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions for the sheriff? Sheriff, we appreciate it. We may have more questions after we hear from Mr. Borst, but thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Sheriff covered it all pretty good. We had a meeting yesterday. We're working hand in hand with him. We're doing an engineering study right now. Mark Worth, our traffic engineer, we collected the traffic data yesterday. We went out and put counters at the intersection yesterday to do our study. And I think, as all of you know, our studies are objective. There's no subjectivity to it. We follow a national standard of determining what is a proper thing to do at these intersections. I think we will be finished sometime next week with our study and be able to report back then. So Mark Borst is here today. If you have any questions, we're not really prepared to get down into too much detail today, but we can answer some questions if you have them. Be glad to.
Thank you. Mr. Borst?
Good morning. I don't have a lot to add to what's been said already. Our main goal is the safe and efficient use of our infrastructure, our transportation system for our residents and our guests that come to the county. And so to that end, we do review locations where we have significant traffic events. We review locations that we see through our daily work that we think need attention, or through citizen concerns, or through law enforcement getting a hold of us, or whatever other ways. We do have the one website location where people can submit their traffic concerns to us. I get several of those a week. A lot of those are for KDOT or the city of Wichita or someone else, but we do get a few of those that do apply to our system. When we do have a crash like we had this past weekend, we do usually look at that location. We go out and do a field review. We do a traffic study that may include traffic counts, which could include turning counts at peak times. We'll look at speeds. We'll look at crash history, which we've already polled on this location. And we'll also compare it to similar locations. No two locations are identical, but we do try to have consistency. That's really one of the most important things for us, so that when our road users see similar conditions, they can expect to see similar types of control and not have their expectancy violated. So we do coordinate with the law enforcement also to determine if enforcement efforts are effective or not. Their resources are limited by the number of patrol areas they have, and so they can't hit one location constantly, but they can give some, and he did mention they work high crash locations. And as Dave said, we do follow industry practices as far as how we go about the studies. We have some federal guidelines we have to follow with respect to our traffic control devices that we'll put out there. And as he said, we have initiated a study at this location. Our counters are out there now. We'll pick those up at the end of the week. We'll review speeds, and I do know, based on a couple years ago, speeds are in the low 60s on all four approaches there. Now, obviously, north and south stop, but when you are approaching the stop signs, they're all in the 61 or so mile per hour, which is very typical for similar locations in the county. With that, if you have questions, I'd be glad to answer any.
Thank you. Do we have questions from the commission?
I do.
Commissioner Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious, what is the posted speed out there on 21st?
It's 50. Well, it's statutory 55.
Okay.
It's not posted in that immediate vicinity because it is statutory. So we and everyone with a signed driver's license says they know that. So but that's standard for the county highway system.
I know I've gone through that intersection in my lifetime, but I've not done it since this accident. So I'm just, what I've seen in the news and what I remember, I'm just trying to, in my mind, figure out what the configuration is. I understand the stop signs going north and south.
Right. It's two-way stop north-south. They're 48-inch stop signs. We have a 12-inch red flashing beacon mounted above each stop sign, and then below each stop sign is a black legend on a yellow sign that says "Cross traffic does not stop."
And those things, like the larger stop sign and the flashing light and that extra warning, the yellow sign, that little warning there, are those part of what's recommended for the national standards, or are those like going above and beyond what's required to enhance the safety? I mean, I know I see that type of configuration lots of other places. I'm just curious, are we doing that as a matter of just trying to make it more visible, or is that something that's required in terms of larger signs?
Okay, it's not required. We had a number of locations years ago where we had two-way stops. We had 30-inch stop signs, which is the standard size, and then we had overhead four-way beacons that flashed red for the stop approaches and yellow for the non-stop approaches. And what we did was we took those down because the yellow, most people don't pay attention to them. They use it more as a landmark for telling people turn at the yellow flashing light, and or they know that's where they want to turn. So what we did was we took those overhead four-ways down. We went with the larger stop sign because my take was, if we need the beacon out there, let's go with the larger stop sign. Let's post mount that beacon about a foot above the stop sign, and then we take away the yellow on the approaches that have the right of way. And at some of those locations, we've also added the cross traffic does not stop sign, but I don't think we have it at all of them. It's kind of a case by case basis, and we've done it where the perception of the crash history would suggest that maybe we need to remind people they need to take another look.
Is there? I would assume there's probably a sign on 21st that indicates there's an intersection there, but is there anything else besides maybe a sign that probably has a intersection symbol on it?
We
On
don't have the
21st?
intersection symbol. What we have there is for eastbound and westbound, and it's probably in the neighborhood of 500 feet in advance. It's got a sign that says 167th pointing both ways, and then below that it'll say Colwich pointing to the north.
I don't know what time of day this accident happened, but I'm not sure where I even heard this now, but someone said maybe the problem was the sun was setting and was a motorcycle, I assume was on 21st headed eastbound. And
Yes,
so
yeah.
the person
and
maybe was
it
looking
was
to
about
the west towards the
8:15,
sun.
I think, was the time of the crash, and so it would have been in the dusk time frame. So
Yeah, I
sun
don't know
may
how
have
that
played
lines up with this time of year, the sun being maybe lined up
Yeah.
with the road and that type of thing. It'd be an interesting aspect of this discussion, how that sun might have been a factor.
The accident was at 8:15. The sun was going down. Through our investigation, without getting into a lot of details, we contacted a local meteorologist to see if the weather conditions were going to be similar to the night before. They said they was going to be almost the exact same weather conditions. We took a traffic team out there and conducted a study into that. And again, I can't get into a lot of it because that could be raised as a potential defense.
Sure.
We do not believe that was a contributing factor.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate that. And are there any houses around that intersection in terms of?
It's about 1,000 feet.
Okay.
To the north, there are a few houses, and then it's at least that far in any other direction.
Yeah, west, there's another residence there. It's a very clear intersection.
Okay. Well, I'm sure you'll come up with the science book recommendations of what we ought to do, but I know rumble strips sometimes cause lots of problems because of noise and all of that. But, in terms of the things that might happen here, whether it be any changes whatsoever versus, making a four-way stop or a lighted intersection or rumble strips or other maybe flashing lights on 21st Street would warn people. I don't know what kind of recommendations would come up, but I throw all those things out there as ideas that I think I've heard floated around, and I appreciate what you do. I was on camera yesterday, mentioned the science aspect of this. It's like a science book, in my opinion. You guys are very objective, and you look at data to drive what's best. I would be interested in these other 9 accidents in terms of were they, again, I have no data whatsoever, and so maybe you'll speak to this at some point, but if they were similar situations that happened that caused those other 9 accidents, the other, I forget how many were there, 18 accidents there. If that was a similar situation, someone was crossing in front of someone else coming at 21st.
We kind of had a varied cause of accidents. The largest number was right angle, which this was a right angle. We had 2 where people were passing, one on the left, one on the right, if I remember right. And then we have rear ends where people are slowing down to turn and they get rear-ended. That happens, and if you do go to like a multi-way stop or a traffic signal, those kind of crashes will increase. I use Maple and 167th to the south in this example. We had a number of right angles there. We signalized that location, put in left turn lanes with the signal, and we have eliminated the right angle, but we now have a noticeable number of rear ends, and typically by time of day when school gets out, and no more detail needed there. So,
Okay.
but so it's a varied type of crash that we've had out there.
So I guess my understanding is anecdotally it might feel like there's a right answer, but scientifically the data probably guides us one way or the other, and ultimately you probably can't stop all of the situations that would happen there no matter what you do, but there probably is the best answer in terms of trying to minimize that, and that's what the science book is trying to do, I think.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you for the answers, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I was part of the meeting yesterday, and I appreciate all the folks that were in the meeting, where we could take a look at this intersection and the accident itself. It's right in the middle of my district, so it's something that's very near and dear to my heart, what's going on out there. Mark Borst is a traffic engineer. That's what his job is to take a look at that. He takes a look at that based on national standards. All of the devices that we use when we're controlling traffic out here are based on national standards. And he's going to be conducting a study. He's already started the study on exactly what happened out there in conjunction with our sheriff, so that we can make sure that we know exactly what was going on at that point. What we know at this point is very limited, and a lot of it is still not being released. But we know that the individual stopped at a stop sign, so the stop sign worked. However, he pulled out in front of the officer. This is a tragedy for our community. We're deeply saddened by the loss of this officer and his son. This morning, if those of you that might have come in the front door might have noticed across the street, I noticed KFDI has an event going on at the Law Enforcement Memorial across the street, where if any of you want to go after this and sign a law enforcement flag or to leave condolences for the family. They're also taking collections across the street that can help this family out. So if you're inclined, go over and make a donation. All of the money, from what I understand, listening to the radio, is going to go directly to the family to help them in this time of need. As far as anything that happens from this point forward, obviously safety and security of our citizens is our top priority as commissioners in this county. And we're going to continue to follow up on what's going on. We're sincerely appreciative of the sheriff and all of the information that he's provided us this morning. We're appreciative of Public Works and what they're doing. This is not going to happen overnight. We're going to take a look at it, and we're going to do a scientific study, and we won't have answers for the press and the people that want something immediately. It'll be a couple weeks before that we find out exactly what changes might be needed or what's happening at this intersection. But we're looking forward to the analysis from our safety engineers and Public Works and the assistance of our sheriff, and we sincerely appreciate everything that we've gotten at this point. I know people are going to want more information sooner rather than later, but we're going to do it exactly the right way. We're going to do it with scientific standards. So I do appreciate the sheriff and Mr. Borst and Public Works being here today. And thank you very much. Mr. Manager.
All right, last but not least, I'll push it to David, and we'll talk about the Stormwater Management Advisory Board.
SMAD, Stormwater Management Advisory Board. They had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and Susan came to me and said she thought it was time to give a status report of the SMAB, show you give you a little history, what they've done, and maybe we can try to figure out what our next step might be. So, Susan.
I'm going to start.
Jim Weber and Susan are going to do the PowerPoint.
We'll try to keep it moving. There are 42 slides, but we can keep it going. I'm going to start. I think I'm doing the first. Just point out that this year is the 20th anniversary of the Halloween floods of 1998. So give you I guess I'm covering the first 10 years. So a brief history is we had floods in 1998. They were big. By 2004, the city manager and the county manager had created a task force to look at floodplain management across the county. Between 98 and 2004, there was a city-county funded study by Black and Veatch to look at some major drainage issues. In 2001, we created a task-specific stormwater management department. So there were things going on. The task force met, and by the end of 2005, they had produced a report and laid out 7 initiatives for action. Next slide might be a little hard for you, but I will do my best here. This is a graphic that shows the cumulative rainfall in the 98 floods, and there are county lines in here, but you see the yellow blob. So Sedgwick County is right basically that yellow blob. Inside the yellow, it goes to yellow is 6 inches of rain. There's orange. As it goes to orange, it's 8, and like a burnt orange, it's 10. So there are 10-inch rainfalls embedded in this thing. This is just a photo that Susan's people were able to pull up from one of the news sites. This is the town of Sedgwick, 10 inches of rain in 98, a lot of water. That flood, and these numbers cover the region. You saw that big blob. It's bigger than Sedgwick County, but there were $37.8 million in damage. There's one death, and honestly, we don't think it was in Sedgwick County. We're not sure where it was, but the media reported one death. And there were 5,300 people that were evacuated during that event. So the task force was created. They came out of that with a set of initiatives that they thought were important to move forward on. So one of them is public awareness. People really still didn't, and maybe don't today, understand how flooding works, what the issues are. There was an initiative to keep acquiring flood-prone properties through the FEMA or otherwise, but FEMA has a mitigation program where you can go out and the county has bought them over the years, flood-prone properties, and taken them out of action. Creation of uniform standards for drainage design. Develop a governmental framework. How would we deal with this flood issue regionally? Conduct some basin studies and do some planning. Evaluate the FEMA CRS system. That's a community rating system. So that is, you do certain things and you can get discounts on the flood insurance. That was one of the things they were thinking about. And then, of course, to maintain the flood conveyance channels. The organizing committee went through the work that the task force had done, and this was, again, another pretty large group. It had kind of a governmental focus on it because the thought was the solution is a governmental solution. Their challenges were to evaluate means and methods to create a regional flood control or stormwater management effort, and to identify permanent funding source to address flooding issues throughout the county. The organizing committee finished their work in 2007. They recommended the creation of a stormwater management advisory board, and there's a charter for that board that we're still using today. They recommended a charter in kind of a draft form, and I think we essentially adopted that charter the way they put it together. So on the 9th anniversary of the Halloween floods, the Board of County Commissioners created the Stormwater Management Advisory Board. The makeup of that board is that each of the commissioners has one appointment to the board, and every city, drainage district, watershed district, anybody in the county that's in the drainage business is invited to nominate a member to the board, and the county commission to appoint them to the board and get them started to work. And the resolution did, set out that charter that we're working off of today yet. So the charter items were, they need to work to promote basin planning and interjurisdictional planning, master planning for stormwater management, serve as a technical clearinghouse. These do tend to be people who, they're staff people. We have city managers, we have city engineers, we have a variety of people, but they do tend to be more technical people. Again, we've highlighted in red, work on a long-term dedicated funding source, and establish priorities in stormwater management for stormwater studies and management projects. Develop recommended minimum standards. We did go ahead with the City of Wichita. We do have a joint city-county stormwater manual that we're both working out of. There are slight differences because we're not exactly the same, but basically, if you're an engineer in this town and you're working on a drainage plan, it doesn't matter whether you're in or out of the city limits, you know what needs to be done. Public awareness and education programs. Again, this theme of let's make sure people are up to speed with how this works. Create and maintain GIS mapping of flood-prone areas and stormwater projects. And then participate in a cooperating technical partners program. That's a program that we haven't seen the need to go ahead and do, but it was a program that was set up by FEMA to help with mapping, where local communities could do their own mapping. Next slide. I'm not going to read them all to you, but this is the membership that's been pretty steady in this map, and we've always had 5 of the county commission appointees, and we've had quite a variety of cities. The larger cities probably are more prominent. The watershed districts are actively involved. I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Okay. Very good. All right, to start with the next 10 years, we look at the fact that after SMAP was created, we still had extensive flooding occur in our communities. There's a 2008 flood with 5 to 11 inches of rain in 5 hours, depending on where you were located. From that, personal damage was $3.8 million. 114 homes were damaged from surface water. Plus, you had the sump pumps that backed up and went into people's homes, so 141 homes were damaged that way. And the county spent $2.9 million on damage to infrastructure. So it doesn't just affect homes, it also affects government and what we have to pay for flooding. SMAP was given annual money at that point, and I think it was $200,000 to address issues on flooding and what could they do for their charter. So SMAP had worked through the county to go out to bid to hire some contractors. One was to develop a business plan back in 2010, and the business plan was to minimize threats to life, property, and infrastructure. What could they do to help prevent flooding that causes those threats? Enhance the quality of life for citizens throughout Sedgwick County, whether you're directly impacted by your home or indirectly. Maybe it's on your drive to work that the flooding's occurring and affecting your life. Maybe your work environment has been flooded. Making investments to avoid future taxpayer liabilities. So as we put off doing these projects, we may increase the cost of those projects in the future. Also, the business plan included building public support for actions through education, activities, behaviors. So how can we educate the public on these issues? We needed to look at economic development, and some of the projects that the SMAP has worked on has shown if you get some areas out of flooding, you could have economic development and businesses going in areas, and protecting the environmental quality of our county. SMAP activity went into specific goals, and there were 10 of those, but what's really important for our presentation today are these three: avoid future liabilities, secure dedicated funding, and educate the public on how important these issues are and why addressing flooding and stopping it is important. They paid for 2 projects through the money that was allocated to them. Spring Creek Basin Watershed is north of Derby and down into the city of Derby. Was completed in January 2014. It's 32 square miles and identified many ways to improve and address flooding issues, not only in the city of Derby but north of there. And this map shows the outline of that watershed of the 32 square miles. One of the proposals was to put in a 80-acre lake in that area, which would help control the flooding. So there's many ways to control flooding, and they addressed quite a few of those. There was also a study done on the west branch of the Chisholm Creek watershed up in the Valley Center Park City area. It's 18 square miles, and it also identified potential improvements. And some of those they're looking at for economic development, where some businesses would go in if certain areas are not flooded anymore. And this outlines that area. You have 53rd Street down to the south, 77th on the east, up to around 119th Street. So it's important to look at what's in a watershed, because what you do in one area may impact another area, maybe negatively if you do it incorrectly. And education, they've spent money with Patty Banks Associates to come up with education spots that not only are on our website, but also with the committees make up a variety of cities. They took it back to their cities and had inserts into water bills that they would send out and educated the public that way. And just to give an idea of these 3 photos, it could be your house flooding, your business flooding, or your roads that you travel every day. So just because it doesn't affect your house doesn't mean it doesn't impact your life. SMAP activity also used a survey back in 2010 and worked with Patty Banks Associates to create the survey. They randomly selected 1,500 residents and 587 business leaders to send those surveys out to. They had 428 responses from the residents, 151 from the businesses. And on certain issues, developing countywide stormwater maintenance system, 88% of the residents and 91% of the businesses agreed that there should be a countywide maintenance system. Protection of rural streams, 86% of residents, 89% of businesses agreed. And restriction on building in floodplains, 85% for both. On funding for these programs, they asked questions about, are you willing to spend at least $1 a month? And 75% of the residents said yes, 77% of the businesses. Are you willing to spend $250 a month? 44% of the residents and 33% of the businesses. And how about $5 a month? 17% of residents, 45% of the businesses were willing to spend at least $5. Less than a quarter were said, no, we're not willing to spend anything. So 76% of the people said they're willing to spend some money on addressing funding issues. And back in 2009, when the county was looking at this, and they contacted communities to say, what projects do you have out there addressing flooding, stormwater issues? How much do those projects cost? There were 64 projects totaling over $217 million. We just did this again in 2017, asking what projects are out there, what have been completed, what new ones do you have? Let's take the completed one off the list. 78 projects now totaling over $500 million are out there concerning flooding. Because of this, we looked at what other communities have done. Johnson County seemed a good fit because they have a funding use. They went with the 0.1% sales tax back in the late 80s to fund stormwater projects. We invited them here on September 7th of last year to address everyone in the community. We invited all of the city council members across the county, all of the city managers, all of their stormwater teams and staff. In Johnson County, they have 20 cities just like we do. They had 17 of the 20 cities have used their stormwater fund. They had 190 projects completed so far at a cost of $180 million. And they right now have 20 active projects and $120 million worth of projects yet to be completed. And those keep being added to as time goes on. We worked with Johnson County, looked at what ranking forms they have. Commissioner Howell and the county manager had encouraged the SMAB group to develop ranking forms. We have this long list of projects, which ones are the most important to address. So the SMAB group developed a subcommittee to look at how can we rank these projects. They came up with 2 forms. One of them is an initial form to determine how severe the flooding is, and the other one is more of what's your proposed project to address this flooding issue and what's the cost benefit of that. And I know you can't read these forms, but just to show you, we've developed them. They're fillable forms that we can send out to groups, and these are not finished yet. These are in process. Once we get funding source, I think we'll have use for these and can refine them at that point. And in December of 2016, the county looked at funding options and what were available and worked with Lindsay and Budget to get numbers for this. One method of funding stormwater could be through the mill levy. 1 mill would get us over $4.5 million. If we're looking at $20 million a year because of the amount of projects we have, we'd have to have 4.3 mills. Well, that may be difficult to do because in 2016 the county commissioner set a resolution setting the mill levy amount at a target to not exceed 29.359 mills through 2022, and he actually decreased it after that. And in addition to that, state regulations have changed so that if you were to change the mill levy by a certain amount, then it would have to go out to vote. So this one may not be the best option. Also, we've looked at stormwater fees similar to the solid waste fee that we have. To raise around $20 million, it would be $80 a year on a residential property, and a business would be $120 a year. Currently, just to give you an idea, our solid waste management fee is $5.88 for residents. So this one may be hard also to get through. You need 2/3 of a vote of the governing body, and if the citizens objected, they could require a referendum with 5%. Yes,
That
Commissioner?
would get almost $20 million a year?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And we do it without referendum with the supermajority.
That's correct.
All right.
Another funding option is a sales tax option countywide. There's two sales tax options. One of them, and this shows different amounts you could get if it was a tenth of a penny, a quarter, or a half. On this option, though, the county only would receive about 28% of the sales tax revenues. Remember, this was done back in 2016. These numbers would be different if we did it today. But the rest would be split between the cities. And this is based on the current system, and you would require a public vote to implement this. The second tax option, a tenth of a penny with county receiving all of the funds, would be $10,760,000 a year. And this one would require legislative change. That's what happened with Johnson County back in the late 1980s. It was put out for, I think it was 87, 88, and 89 time period, any county in the state that wanted to implement a stormwater sales tax fee could do it. Johnson County was the only county that did it in that time period. We could address the state again to say we would like to do something similar again to open it up for all counties in the state. And it was not subject to public vote. Doesn't mean you can't go out and public vote if you want to, but it's not subject to it. Recently, because of our connection with WSU, they looked at funding options and what should we do. They reviewed the business plan, the survey that was done back in 2010. They saw no need for another survey. They thought it was done very well, had good percentage results from it. One recommendation they had was to create a new stormwater advisory team of 10 to 12 citizens that would look at funding sources and make recommendations, maybe meet twice a month for 6 months at a cost of $14,550. And that phase 2 would follow that with an outreach and education program to the public so they would know how important flooding is. They presented this at our last SMAB meeting. And from that, the SMAB said they know there's $60,000 in the public works budget right now to look at flooding and educating the public. They did not see the need to have another team reinvent the wheel and go over issues that we've been going over time and time again since the Halloween flood, basically, but with SMAB since 2008. And what they want is direction from elected officials. They asked city staff to go to their elected officials and county to come to ours, and that's why we're here today. And what are our next steps for moving forward on this issue? Comments they have made is that they're a diverse group. They have people representing different cities and watersheds and drainage districts on the group, that they would feel that any proposals for flooding from the projects would be filtered through SMAB. They would look at it. They would recommend who passes the first cost share, the first form, then the cost share form. SMAB would vote on it. It would not be biased that way, like one government trying to hold money from another government or biased to a government. And then the projects would be ranked for funding. If they were looking at maybe a 80-20% match on the funding, 80% from the stormwater fund, 20% from the community, and then it would be voted on by SMAB and final approval by the BOCC. So we still have flooding. Here's Beckley Drive near Robertson Middle School in Wichita in May 19th, 2017. Extensive flooding there. Mulvane, 2016, Channel 12 News at night showing the flooding, and here during the day you can see flooding in Mulvane. Derby, 2016, there's upper left, you can see road closed from the flooding and runoff going off into the areas. You have houses flooding from this. Cowskin Creek, 13th Street North, 119th West. Streets had to be closed in 2016. So flooding is regional. It knows no political boundaries. It is widespread, and what happens in one area, if you try to fix it, could adversely affect another area. It's expensive not only to personal property or businesses if your place is flooded, but government has to pay for infrastructure that's destroyed. It's disruptive to daily life. It could be devastating if your house is totaled, and it will happen again. We know, we've seen it, and it's going to happen in the future. So the question from SMAP to the board is they'd like to see funding, because they're at a standstill right now. They've got the ranking forms. They've done everything they can. They've developed education programs. They can develop more. But they want to know what we can do going forward. So I'm here representing SMAP board to this board. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thanks, Susan. I know we have several other representatives in the audience today. I don't know, Joe Frazier is here from Wichita. Do you have anything that you'd like to add or anything from Wichita's perspective?
Be happy to answer any questions that you might have for us in terms of your consideration today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Kathy Sexton's here from Derby. Do you have anything from Derby you'd like to add?
Thank you very much. Susan did a great job of expressing not only the work that the SMAP has done over the last 10 years. It's hard for me to believe that it took 10 years to create a system to have an advisory board for the county commission, and then another 10 years of advising, so to speak, working on issues, and we still don't have a funding source. So we are, as Susan indicated, very frustrated and feeling like that it's really time for the county to decide something on funding. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anyone else in the audience that I didn't recognize that would like to add anything today? Okay. Commissioners, do you have questions?
I do, but I hate to, thank you for the opportunity to speak to this. So one thing that wasn't talked about with the presentation was I'll use the term I prefer, the Mitch McConnell floodway. Do we have any numbers in the room here that talks about what that costs to maintain currently? What's the cost going to be, let's say, 10 years from now?
Okay. Flood control has, for a long time, runs about $1 million a year for the city and $1 million a year for the county for the operating, the O&M. So that comes out through your operating budget. And then we have each been contributing $500,000 a year for capital improvements, and most of that recently has been going to the tow drain projects. A year ago, we had gotten a submittal from the city that suggested that the needs were going to go up in the kind of the near future because of their anticipation of needing to do some projects on some of the drainage structures that go through the levee. We started talking to them about 45 days ago, I think. They have put together a revised CIP submittal that we have looked at with them that shows, and Joe Hickle's here and he's got the thing, but I think I'll be pretty close. Basically, the CIP end of this stays pretty flat at $500,000 a piece per year, pretty close to 15 years, right?
2026.
2026 before it starts to go up. They have, in doing their due diligence, they've gone in, they've done a lot of television inspection of the major structures through the levee. A lot of them are corrugated metal pipes, which we expect to go down in about 50 years because they were well done. They have good slopes on them. Turns out those things have more life left in them, so they're pushing some of those projects out farther. So we're flat for at least 8 years, I guess, is what they're proposing at $500,000. So our total investment, 1.5 a year. Their total investment, 1.5 a year.
What about down the road? I heard that the number will go up. I guess you say 2026. That's 8 years out. But what's the price going to happen? What's going to happen at that point?
I don't have that whole thing with me, but we can sure get it to you. But it doesn't. It goes up not as dramatically as you think. How?
About $24 million total in 15-year plan.
$24 million total in a 15-year plan.
Okay.
Of course, we run a 5-year CIP, so a lot of that is beyond our planning horizon right now.
Okay. Yeah, I asked someone for a projection. And they said in about 10 years from now, that kind of gets very expensive, and the numbers get closer to 8 or 10 million a year total for the two government bodies.
Okay. Well, again, You haven't seen it, but the most recent stuff is nowhere near that dramatic.
Okay. Well, since Joe is in the room, I'm curious, has anybody from the city spoken to the prospects? I think the only, and I agree with what Kathy said, if we're going to do this, we ought to have a discussion about funding, if we're going to go forward. But the city of Wichita is, of course, our biggest partner in this, and so I'd like to know what their position is on this. And with the idea that, I guess my idea would be, if there was going to be revenue, it would take care of the floodway first, and only leftover dollars would be used on grant basis, on priority basis. That SMAB would figure out what projects are the most important, biggest financial benefit for the cost. So with that in mind, does the city have an opinion on any of this?
Yes, sir. First of all, the city's appreciative of the SMAB and being a part of the SMAB. As you well know, the water doesn't represent or respect jurisdictional boundaries. And so Derby's a good example. A lot of Derby's problems occur outside of Derby and impact Derby. Some of the rain that falls in Derby may not impact Derby, but it impacts folks downstream. So we do think that the SMAB in concept and the coordination of projects, obviously the city of Wichita and Sedgwick County, but all the jurisdictions is important. Second thing is, we believe that the concept of a cost-benefit study, to do each project, to rank each project, to look at the benefit of each project as it competes against other stormwater projects, is very important. However, we strongly recommend that cost-benefit analysis be dollars of cost against dollars of estimated benefit. Estimating benefits is a challenge. The alternative is to use points, and if you use points, it becomes more subjective. If it becomes subjective, then the bottom slide on page number 6 becomes very important. That's the composition of the SMAP. That composition does represent the interjurisdictional cooperation aspect very well, but it doesn't represent a necessary spread between where the resources would come or where they would be spent countywide. If it's dollars to dollars, you minimize the impact of that because you're looking at how many dollars of benefit do you get for dollars expended on projects. The third thing is, in terms of the WSU study or other efforts going forward, if there were to be an effort to look at funding studies, we think it's really important that there be 2 guiding committees. The first one would be composed of the technical experts. And as you've heard on other items today, there are technical aspects and policy aspects of all of these questions. There would be a second group that would be the policy level perspective. That'd be the senior appointed officials and or elected officials. The next thing we think is whatever process is used to develop a program going forward, it's important that elected officials get a frequent opportunity to weigh in on how that's being designed and what it would look like, how it would operate, because obviously you're ultimately responsible to the folks that elected you. We have taken a lot of actions on our own, the city of Wichita. Late last year, we revised our stormwater fees that we charge all parcels inside the city limits. We made this a much fairer process. We made it a much more detailed process in terms of how much you pay for impervious area that's on each parcel within the city. And as a result of that, we now have a revenue stream that is much easier for our elected officials to adjust as they see fit to finance projects that would be taken on by the city of Wichita and our stormwater utility. We also think that because there are differences between the municipalities within the county and differences between the incorporated and unincorporated part of the county, that any scheme going forward will at the very least have an opt-out provision for jurisdiction. If you don't want to pay, you don't pay. If you don't pay, you don't get to play. Ideally, it would have an opt-in requirement so that if jurisdictions wanted to be a part of the scheme that would be multi-jurisdictional, they would opt in.
So you're saying that any one of these funding schemes, you would like to see an opt-out provision for another sub-jurisdiction.
We think it's important to represent the political autonomy of the individual entities so that they'd have that option. Again, if it's a good plan for a given municipality, they wouldn't need to exercise an opt-out, or they could exercise an opt-out.
So again, I think if this was a county-led funding stream, I'm not sure if that's possible. I guess we have to have legal take a look at that and find out whether that's possible for someone to be taxed differently within the county's jurisdiction without, I mean, I don't know how that would work. So I guess I have a concern about
Good
that.
technical question, yes.
Yeah, and then, there was a couple of proposals here. One of them talks about sales tax of a tenth of a cent that is divided out. One of them is keeps it all one great big chunk. In either case, it generates the same dollars, but part of it becomes, controlled by various jurisdictions versus controlled by, I would call it a SMAB authority. My opinion would be that the larger chunk of money would be something I'd like to see that stay together, because I think some of these projects are fairly large, and they might not be inside of a city. Could be anywhere in the county. Potentially could even be outside the county. I don't know that. I mean, I think it'd be a part of our discussion is to put the money where it has the most use, wherever that happens to be. That would be the way we'd go forward. But so to me, a larger chunk of money would be more useful in terms of trying to attack regional problems. So out of these options, the only one I think is interesting to me is that one funding option that keeps that money all together. But I would rather see that have some direction from the SMAB board. And although it says it's not subject to a public vote, my opinion is we would want a public vote. But let me see, the urban area designation might be able to allow Sedgwick County to deal with this independently. But regardless, I would like to see a public vote on this, because voter approval of tax increases is one of our principles here in Sedgwick County. So, to the extent that people think this is important, and I do think taxation for infrastructure is something we do right now. We've always done that. Every city does that. Every county does that. We have taxes currently that pays for infrastructure. The question is to what degree, to what amount. If it's something that people believe in and think it's something they support, then they would have a chance to say so. And I do think that people have a long enough memory. They know that water supply and flood issues, those issues come and go with rains. But this is a good time. We might talk about a water supply because we're in the middle of a drought right now. But the reality is, in the middle of 2016, when we were having all these huge floods, I think if you would have brought the issue up of water supply, people would still be interested in having that discussion in the middle of 2016. And although it might have been more convenient to have a discussion about floodwaters in the middle of 2016, and now we're in the middle of a drought, I think we can still have that discussion today. And people have a memory. They know that this is going to happen again. And even if they've not been directly impacted by this, they know someone who has. Everybody knows someone who's been impacted by this. And I think connecting this to the Mitch Mitchell floodway, to me, is a point that says that we no longer need to politically appropriate dollars towards that. It becomes a long-term, forever solution to maintaining something essentially off budget. So if the people want that, then they would vote for it potentially. I think that's something we ought to consider allowing voters to speak to. I'm not stating my position on it. I don't know what I would vote myself, but I do think the people ought to have an understanding that there's a proposal out there, allow them to understand what that would do, and potentially they would support it. Any leftover dollars of that, I think, would be available as grant funds on a priority basis. Again, from a SMAB authority, they would essentially grade projects. You mentioned points, but possibly it's another way to do that. That's not for me to decide, but essentially there will be some leftover dollars. And I think out of these options, it's a more modest solution. At best, it's probably more than 50 years to attack the things we know right now. So I'll never see the end of it, even at that small amount of money. If you did it more aggressively, the $20 million was mentioned a minute ago, that's about a 25-year plan based on what we know right now, if you did not take care of the Mitchell floodway. So if you take Mitchell floodway off that and you did about half those dollars, it's probably a 100-year plan to deal with the issues we know of. And maybe this isn't maybe it's not very aggressive, but at least you're starting the process. And right now, what's frustrating the SMAB is there's $0. That's why are we going to meet if there are not going to be any funds to deal with any of these projects? If that's where we're at, there's never going to be any dollars, then there's no reason for them to meet. So they did stop meeting for a while because politically there was not support from the commission. they didn't see a path forward. They'd stopped meeting for, I don't know, a couple of years, I guess. But because of the floods of 2016, they decided it was best to go ahead and meet and initiate this discussion. We have new commissioners and more recent events that caused us to have a bit more robust discussion. But I do think that we need to decide if there's going to be a funding stream or not. If there's going to be one, then they have relevance. If there's not going to be one, I don't see why they would meet. I might also say that Johnson County does not do stream maintenance, but of course it's much different than our county. We're about 80% rural, and they're about 20% rural. But they don't spend money doing stream maintenance. They leave that up to cities entirely. Sedgwick County does take a role in that. We have bolstered that by 50% increase this year. There was some cuts back in, I believe, 2010 or 2009 or so. It's been a while. I'm not sure when that cut was made. But we are reinvested in that, added some more equipment and some more personnel, so our stream maintenance is now better than it has been better than it has been in the recent past. But it's still just a small amount what needs to be done here, and I wouldn't suggest we would stop doing that in any way. Even though Johnson County doesn't do that, most of their money from their 10% sales tax goes towards, infrastructure. That's bridges and conduits to get stormwater away from the cities. I think that this is a good discussion. I would also say I still see relevance in cities assessing the stormwater fees. If there's going to be a grant program, they'll still need some revenue to access whatever dollars are available from this revenue fund. So that gives them reason to continue showing city responsibility towards generating revenue, however they want to do that. So anyway, I think there's some good things about this. I'm willing to continue the discussion and try to get this out where people might have a better chance to speak to the idea, whether it should go forward or should not go forward. I don't like more taxes, but I do like the idea of solving problems. And if this is infrastructure and people support it, then I guess I'm open to that discussion. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Anything else from the commissioners? Well, I've got, I guess, some final comments. I retired from the Air Force in '97, moved to Wichita, and started building a house, which I moved into in '98, and finally, luckily, built it up on the highest point because with the following flood, my house was an island. Everybody around me was flooded because the Cowskin decided to break over into the North Fork of the Calfskin and flood Rainbow Lakes down through there, down south of Maple, on into the Dell, so I got to see it firsthand immediately after moving into my new home. So I recognize firsthand the problems that all my neighbors faced as a result. And it is a regional issue. Whatever we're looking at, it's going to be a regional issue. And it can't be a Wichita issue because, for example, I live in the city of Wichita, but the Cowskin and Calfskin were in the county. So whatever happens has to be looked at totally on a region. I do appreciate the comments that Mr. Prager made, though, that I think that we do need a technical committee to take a look at the technical issues and then bring it to another committee that's made up of elected officials because they're going to have to set the policy and decide what kind of funding and so forth and where those funding sources come from. So I do believe that that's a very valid recommendation. We've got something like 20 cities in Sedgwick County, and of course the big elephant is Wichita, obviously, because they're the largest city. So whatever we decide to do is going to have to be worked out with our major elected officials, but I don't want to discount any of the other ones. Derby has a huge impact on this, and Sedgwick, which flooded the town of Sedgwick, and so forth. There's Valley Center's had flooding, so I think we're probably going to need to get a group of elected officials in some kind of forum together to sit down and decide what the will is for moving forward for funding. Because until we have dollars, the SMAB isn't going to be able to accomplish much. So I don't know what the solution is on getting funding in the long term, but until we get everyone to sit down and talk about it, so I think that's something we need the Derbys, Hayesvilles, this other smaller communities, plus the city of Wichita and Sedgwick County, to sit down and talk about this regional problem that we've got. So I appreciate the update today. We haven't given you any guidance on where to go with the SMAB, other than I think the SMAB is the technical committee that we need out of the two groups, and that they're valuable, but I think we're going to need some consensus on how we come about with funding before that you can do much more. Any other comments on that?
Just a final comment, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Howe.
Thank you. I have attended the SMAB board every time they've met since they started meeting again. And that's a great group of people. Again, it's a regional board. They have great discussion, and I have attended that, and I would encourage the other commissioners to please attend that, at least some if you can. I think it would be good to have maybe a deeper discussion with the members of that board. They're not all here today. A number of them are. But I think it's an opportunity for us to understand this deeper. And so, again, I take this as I'm a messenger. I feel like I've heard what they've said. I've heard what they've asked for. And I feel like I'm doing my due diligence to bring that to this discussion a little bit deeper. I've asked a lot more questions. I plan on continuing this discussion. But it is a political discussion. And if the city of Wichita it would oppose this, for example, I don't think there's any way to go forward. So if they want it, then we may continue. If out of our county, if the 20 cities altogether, there's major opposition from the other cities, I don't think there's any way we're going to go forward. This is going to require legislative change, and I don't want a big debate in front of the legislature about a solution that we don't have agreement amongst our important partners across this county. So the only way this is going to go forward is if we perceive there's public support as well as support from cities, then I think this continues to have viability. If we start seeing opposition from the city of Wichita or other cities across the county, or this blows up to be a big political campaign, people don't want to see tax increases, and I get that, then I think this is just going to kill it. So to the extent this is something I believe right now is reasonably supported, from what I understand by looking at the study, it's basically one dime on $100 worth of spending, and about 30% is paid for by people passing through the county that don't even live here. So those are the numbers. It's about $14 or so, $15 per average household income. So an average household would spend about $15 a year on this sales tax if this was to be what we did. So those are some of the numbers. But I'm cautiously looking at this and saying, once the politics becomes clear that there's opposition, I'm not going to continue to become the messenger for this. So I'm only a messenger as long as it has support from all of the partners across the county. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. You have something, Commissioner Unruh?
Well, I mean, I think that the folks from the SMAB board would like for us, at least as a county commission, to come to some sort of at least preliminary decision. I mean, are we going to advocate for a funding stream or not? I mean, it's going to have to start with us. If we appointed the board, we financed that SMAB board for a while. So to just say, well, we got to wait and see what the city might say. I mean, we can do that, but I mean, are we willing to say as a Board of County Commissioners, we think this is important, and we're willing to get behind a funding stream, whether it's a sales tax, which seems to be the method that we've talked most about, or not. If we're not going to get behind it as this commission, we ought to let the SMAB board know that. But it's got to start with us. So, I mean, are we ready to make that kind of decision today, or do we need more? But these folks have been meeting for a long time. I think they want us to say, are you in or are you not? And if we're not, I think they'll say, okay, we got our answer. But if we are in, then we need to tell them that we're going to try to advance this and bring the city of Wichita along. I agree that if the city of Wichita is not in agreement with some sort of funding plan and administration plan where they have a substantial say, I don't think they're going to be with us. So I'm not exactly asking for a vote, but I mean, it seems like we need to say, are we in it or not?
Mr. Chairman? So, obviously, one of the arguments would be if you did a sales tax, Wichita's going to pay the vast majority of that percentage-wise. But I also think they stand to benefit the very most. Number one, we just talked about the Mitchell floodway. Right now, that is a funding appropriation that I think has not always got the support from everyone, believe it or not, that it probably deserves. And so I think that that is a concern of mine. But with respect to dollars that would be left over, that would be SMAB authority directed, Wichita probably stands to gain the most from this proposal because they've got the most projects probably that would be would be considered by the SMAB board. It would be a thing where you have trusting somebody else, but it's you don't have direct control, but you'd be using a process whereby your projects would get looked at and studied and analyzed, hopefully objectively. And if those projects are the best projects, then they would receive funding. But Wichita stands to gain the most out of this, probably. But second of all, I would say the way to go forward probably would be, rather than us take a position, I would like to hear from the 20 cities. I think the 20 cities need to have a deep understanding of what's been discussed here and get them to decide, are they going to support it as councils across this county or not? Because again, we could do this we could host a large meeting and have cities come and do a presentation and get their input. We could survey them with letters through the mail. We could attend their meetings and describe it and get them to hopefully declare with a proclamation or resolution what their position officially is. But until we hear from those 20 cities, I don't know that I'm willing to take a position, only because I think it's a good idea. Personally, I understand it. But when someone hears the word tax increase, they react. And if there's going to be opposition of cities, out of the 20 cities, and especially the city of Wichita, if there's going to be opposition, I have no interest in going forward. I'm not going to spend political, collateral on something, fighting for some idea that there's not support, and there's no way it's going to go forward in Topeka if there's not widespread support from the community itself. So I think what we ought to do is officially open this up to finding out what the cities think by taking the information to them and get them to understand at a deep level and weigh in what is their official position of those cities. And once we know that, then we can make a decision whether we want to continue this process or peel away because there's not support. I don't think we have to make a decision today, other than I think our decision ought to be to more aggressively get the messaging out to cities and see where we are politically with people and the community itself, as well as the official city positions on this proposal. And once we have that data back, then we would know whether we should go forward or not. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Mr. Manager, are you able to draft a letter to all 20 cities and put forth the questions that have come up and see if there is interest in moving forward and in which ways that we could move forward?
Certainly we could do something like that. I would be interested to go back to the SMAB and just kind of ask them a question in what is the best way. It seems like there's indication that at least the commission wants to look at a process of going to the next step. So is it a letter? Is it a meeting that we just need to pull and invite all these people to a policy board meeting, which is one of the recommendations that they presented to you? What is that best next step? So,
in September last year, every community was invited to that meeting we had out at WATC, right?
That's correct.
How many attended? I know there were a lot of people there, but do you know from our county how many attended that meeting?
I don't remember the number right off. I would know it was over half of the cities were present.
Half the cities were there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So they should have some background, because we've all seen that briefing that was given out there. We need to know what the city's political will is, because I'm not going to take something to Topeka and have a conflict between the major cities and the county, because it will fail in Topeka.
it would be helpful to have something like that again and almost brief them the same type of slide presentation to get them up to speed where, you know, the SMAB and the board is, but then to ask them that question. And then if there's majority support, And I would say that almost like there are a certain number. You need to have the board, the City of Wichita, Derby, some of the big players here on board. Otherwise, it's kind of a moot. Right? So they're almost a quint of of big players that need to be there.
Well, I don't have a problem with having another meeting. We could go back out to WATC to the nice conference room that they've got out there, and we could bring it up. We're going to have to get some information to all 20 of those cities, though, so that they know what we're going to be talking about ahead of time, so they're prepared to come in and give us their ideas.
Well, this would be the backbone to that policy board they're talking about. So,
Okay. And we can do that. We have the list that we invited them last fall to the meeting. We can make sure that list is up to date, invite city managers, city councils, staff, come to that, do a presentation. And I think that's very important, just like we're talking about if we went to vote for the citizens, they need to know what they're voting on, how important it is. We need to do the same thing for that group.
Okay.
all right,
So is that enough guidance?
that's plenty of guidance.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I'd like to also know, I don't know how you would handle this at that meeting, but one of the problems we have with this proposal, there's many options. And I think that to simplify, I can tell you right now, out of the options, I'm not interested in 4.3%. A 4.3 mil levy increase. I'm not going to support that. So, to me, some of this is less desirable. The sales tax, if it's divided out, in my opinion, it loses something. I feel like I'm not trusting the SMAB board to do their job, and we're trying to manage projects within our own jurisdiction. In other words, we see ownership of those dollars. We don't trust the regional application of those dollars to do the biggest thing for the buck. But so. My concern is I want each city somehow to speak to this. I think at the end of the day, if you have people in the room and say 2 council members out of 7 show up, and one of them says, yeah, I like the idea, and one says, no, I don't, then what do we do? Do we have an answer yet? Will that city is supportive or not? I don't know. But part of this is an educational aspect. If they don't understand the presentation, I would almost like to have them reserve their support or objection to this until they understand what's being proposed. I heard through a grapevine that someone in Wichita kind of reacted to this kind of negatively because I don't think they understood necessarily all of what's been discussed here. And that's happened to me a couple of times. A couple of experiences I've had with people in Wichita, positions of leadership that kind of reacted, but they don't really understand, I think, the full proposal here. So education is part of this. Right. Ultimately, I'd love to get each city somehow as a jurisdiction to weigh in as a jurisdiction. Second of all, the morning meeting, I think, is less conducive to many city council members that work full-time jobs.
We can do it at night.
So an evening might be better for them to meet with us. But ultimately, when we poll them, I'd like to know for sure, what city do you represent, and do we have a majority of that city, or do we have, of course, open meetings is going to be an issue. But I think ultimately we're not just polling an audience, a random audience. We want to make sure each of the 20 cities has weighed in an official position once they understand what's been discussed.
But we haven't taken official position, and evidently we're going to go ask for an official position without taking one. My point is, I think we ought to take a position as a commission before we start asking other people. I mean, it just seems like that's the right thing to do. Instead of us just keep saying, well, we don't know, you tell us, and we don't know what we're doing. You can do it that way, but I normally want to go and ask on an issue like this and say, this is what we think is the right solution. Can you, what is your opinion? If we get shot down and we don't go forward. But I just, I just don't feel like we're exercising leadership from county government if we say, well, we got 5 different possibilities here, and we want you to tell us exactly, officially, what you think, but we're not going to tell you exactly, officially, what we think. And I know it just doesn't seem right.
Commissioner, do you want to see if there's consensus to take it to the next level?
Well, I think there is consensus to go ahead and have some meetings, so I don't have to have that answer, but I don't think there's consensus on what a solution is. And I just think we have enough information after 20 years of discussion that we should take a position. Now, maybe we want to, think on that for a week before we do, but I don't know. That's my preference, and I'm 1 vote out of 5.
Well, it seems to me the first decision point is if there's consensus from the commissioners that they even think this is necessary. I mean, is this necessary? Do we even need to have that next meeting? Because, are there commissioners that don't even believe that we even need to apply a mill levy, a sales tax, any more money or support for this? Would you see that as the kind of the first decision point?
Well, yeah, that's first half step.
But I think we need to look at existing revenue sources to begin with to make sure we're allocating it in the best way possible. But because I don't think we are all the time, but it takes political will to say I'm not going to spend money on some stuff that's not necessary. So it's going to be a hard sell. I mean, if you're going to offer a tax increase to constituents, I got to be able to look my constituents in the face and say, well, we're spending the money we got right now appropriately and most efficiently as possible, and there's nothing else we can do, and I can't say that at this point. And if you're going to push through a tax increase no matter what, I mean, there are certain versions that would be more preferable and less harmful and fair and all that other sort of stuff. I think that's very clear, and so there's a lot of. But I do think it's important to talk to the other communities, because regardless, if we're going to have a tax increase, I mean, people already get to have the feeling that people thought we just jam stuff down. We don't even listen, don't ask questions. We get criticized that you didn't ask us or anything. Well, go out and ask them. It didn't hurt to ask, but you don't have to. You never know what may happen or what they think, and I think that's important to seek that out. I don't see what the issue is there, but.
So I'm not misunderstood. I think we need to have that dialogue. I just think we ought to take a position, and if it gets support, we go forward. If it doesn't get support, then we quit doing it. I just think it's hard to go out and ask somebody, we want you to make a definite position, but take a definite position, and that's what I think I heard. But we're not going to take it. I mean, that's my hang-up. But yeah, we still need to have a dialogue. And if this commission says, I don't care what you all say, we'll go through the process, but there's not the will here to do a tax increase of any kind, whether it's a fee or tax, well then let's say that. We're not doing it. My general feeling is we're not doing it. So let's not pretend. I mean, it's a lot of staff work, it's a lot of paperwork, it's a lot of different small communities. For example, one thing I guess we could find out, if City of Wichita says, you guys, we appreciate it, but unless we get the majority influence on the board, because the majority of the revenues will be coming from the City of Wichita, there's no way we'll support it. Maybe that's the first question.
Well, I think that's reasonable. I mean, I've just heard rumors that the City of Wichita is going to oppose any sales tax, and that there's probably not the will to move forward on our side if the City of Wichita is going to oppose it. So I guess maybe that's.
Let's go find that out first. Then.
Where that's the question to ask, because you're right. We don't want to waste our time and money.
Right.
But
we
got to just deal with facts and right now we have rumors and everyone's saying this, that, and that. We need to get an answer.
And if there is this structure we establish and say this is what we're supporting, and Wichita does have, say, a majority voice on it, the smaller communities may say, well, we're not in. Yeah. But I think we got to start somewhere and not just say, well, we don't know anything, but we sure think it would be good. And that's what it seems like we're doing. So I say, Mr. Chairman, you and the manager need to see what the city, you know, if we're reluctant to go forward without their approval, we need to start there.
Well, it appears to me, just listening to Mr. Prazer's comments, that the city has done quite a bit of thinking about this, or he wouldn't have had a complete list of items to discuss today. So I can't think that they haven't thought about this.
You didn't just make that up, huh, Joe?
Let me be clear. This is staff's thinking at this point, and staff feels that we could be supportive of a countywide funding scheme, provided it had that dollar benefit. We understand it's a business of government to move money from one jurisdiction to another. That's the nature of the business. But we think that tied to dollar amounts of benefit and dollar amounts of cost ensures more economic equity as opposed to how the voting is stacked or arranged by the current membership of this matter.
Yeah.
So there are things to work out on this. And that's the reason that I offer that it's important to have elected official input is, you know, I don't have that information this morning. I've just got the staff thinking in terms of what would make sense for us to be able to be supportive in terms of recommendation to our elected officials. I think the meeting that we had on the Johnson County program was very beneficial. I think this briefing begins to bring much more focus as to this is what we're talking about for us and framing up the question.
So the city electeds don't have a position yet. So we need to get that position.
Why don't we bring this back, say, in a week or two and discuss it? We do have a joint meeting with the mayor and vice mayor this afternoon at 2 o'clock, and we can broach the subject at that time and see what their thoughts are on this. And if they're totally opposed to it, I don't see a way forward. But hopefully, with education and obviously the staff, at least in the city of Wichita, is thinking about this. So hopefully they can speak with their manager and the leadership over there, and we can find out what's going on. But I think we'll get a pretty good feel this afternoon if we can bring it up at the meeting that we've got with the mayor and vice mayor at 2 o'clock.
Mr. Chairman, I have one more comment.
Commissioner Howe.
Thank you. You know, I think the SMAB board is doing their very best to keep everything objective, and in the assumption that they wouldn't grade these projects regardless of where they happen to be from, that somehow because of where someone's from is going to create loyalty to spend dollars from their own jurisdiction. I don't know if I kind of reject the idea that we ought to have a majority of the board that's necessarily from one city. I mean, that does create, I think, a potential where someone could seriously funnel all of the money into that one jurisdiction. So this is a very balanced board. The idea that nobody has control, that everybody's a minority on the board. No one represents a majority of the board. They're all just weighing in. I think that's the beautiful thing about this. And then they're doing it objectively. I think we ought to maintain that. I think if you were to readjust the weightings of that board, I think you'd see a lot of concern would suddenly develop. And I don't know that that's going to would work. But rather than making that part of the discussion, I would rather just have people understand exactly what the board is doing currently. The fact of the matter is it's a very diverse county-wide board, has a broad representation from cities from all over the place, and I think that's a valuable thing. To the extent that Wichita would have lots and lots of projects, and they would be objectively scored by what I've already described, they would still get the majority of the money based on the fact that they got more projects. I can't promise that would be that way, but Wichita still stands the greatest recipient of tax dollars, even though, again, they're probably also the ones putting in the most money, but they're also going to benefit the most just by the fact that they would have the most projects. So I'm not sure that the change in the board makeup is really going to help necessarily, but I do think if you did make that part of the discussion and you get their support only with that change, I think you're going to see other opposition develop very quickly. Thank you.
I don't think it's dead right now. I think we need further discussion on it. We'll bring it back at a meeting in the near future. In the meantime, we'll see if the mayor and the vice mayor have a little bit of time after our meeting we've got at 2 o'clock to talk through this, and we will have further discussion.
Sounds good.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Manager, what else do we have today?
Nothing. The manager staff meeting is canceled, but I would like to talk to the SMAB members after this. If you got just a few minutes, I won't take much of your time. That's all I have.
All right. Thanks for everybody being here today. Appreciate it.
When is the auction? When is the auction?
We don't have a date yet. You're very quiet.